Thank you everyone for zooming in tonight to this evening's event through the East Hampton Library. We have with us Evan Weiner, who is going to be discussing presidents in sports from President Andrew Johnson all the way up to the present to Joe Biden. And this presentation is interesting and informative. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat or use the raise hand feature when we get toward the end. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Evan Weiner back to the East Hampton Library.
Yeah, hi Stephen, how are you? And thanks everybody for showing up. And thank you who will be watching this sometime in the future, maybe even in 2186. That is the White House. And this is basically a talk about how presidential decisions in sports impacted general society. And you would never think that way, but there are a lot of instances where it happened. So Andrew Johnson through Joe Biden. Andrew Johnson may have been one of the worst presidents in history. Maybe James Buchanan was worse than he was. But he inherits the United States in the presidency after Lincoln is killed in April of 1865. And one of his jobs that he needs to do is knit the country back into one, get the southern states back into the Union. And he's trying to figure out, well, how am I going to do this? What is a commonality between North and South? Did they do anything in the North? Did they do anything in the South as far as the military was concerned in terms of recreation? And they did. The troops played baseball. It's August 30th, 1865, and President Johnson meets with Washington Nationals and Brooklyn Atlantic players at the White House. Now, this is the first known official meeting between the president and an organized baseball team at the executive mansion. Johnson liked baseball. He really did like baseball. And baseball, well, if you believe the old tale that it was invented by Abner Doubleday in 1839 in Cooperstown, New York. At this point, is only about 25, 26 years old. But baseball was played in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, sometime around 1792. But he did like baseball, and he saw an opportunity after the Civil War to unite the country, national unity through baseball. Didn't work, but he had them at the White House. Ulysses S. Grant is rather an interesting character in terms of baseball. Washington was a backwater town when he was president. In fact, it was backwater literally until he opened the metro in the early 1970s. And not much going on in Washington, not all that developed. And apparently Grant had some free time on his hands. So he would go outside the White House and hang out with the kids and play a little baseball with the kids while he was president, because he didn't really have anything else to do, I suppose. Maybe he was waiting for some lobbyist asking for a job. Anyway, in the 1868 presidential election campaign, Grant and Horatio Seymour were the candidates for president. According to the book Baseball in Blue and Gray by George Kirsch, I don't know if you have that book in the library or not, teams of their supporters once played a game against one another. In 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings become the first official over-the-table paid baseball players in America, although Lippman Pike in 1868 for the Philadelphia Athletics got about $6 for the season, or $6 a game, something like that. They didn't play that many games, but he did lead the world in home runs that year, Lippy Pike. Anyway, on June 26, 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant brought the first professional team to the White House, then called the president's mansion for a visit. This is the first time that all the members of the team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, were paid ball players. Grant versus the kids. I told you that Grant would go behind the White House, sometimes would go in and join the kids in playing baseball. And Grover Cleveland didn't like sports. Here is Grover Cleveland with the Chicago White Stockings greeting Cap Anson, who was the best player of his time. And also in the 1880s was the guy who basically put up the color barrier in baseball. What do you imagine the American people would think of me if I wasted my time going to the ball game? Well, he met Cap Anson, but Grover Cleveland never went to a baseball game. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, it has been suggested, and there's lots of literature on this, saved football, particularly college football. College football, well, there were a lot of deaths on the field, 40 of them, 22 in 1904 and 18 in 1905. And Roosevelt is getting some heat. Get rid of football. Of course, how do you get rid of football? Where are you going to go? Go to the coal mines in Western Pennsylvania and then arrest all these guys who are playing recreational football? Can't be done. But Roosevelt threatened to ban football in America unless the rules were implemented, or unless rules were implemented to make the game safer. After a reported 40 players died from injuries suffered on the field over a 2-year period in 1904 in 1905. Well, Roosevelt didn't want to do this because, as he said, I believe in outdoor games, and I do not mind in the least that they are rough games, or that those who take part in them are occasionally injured, like one of his sons. So how do you go about banning this? How do you go about banning a sport that, well, people like, at least some people like? You just can't. The November 1905 death of Union College halfback Harold Moore, who died of a cerebral hemorrhage after being kicked in the head while trying to tackle a New York University player, causes an outrage. A cartoon in the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune showed the Grim Reaper atop a goalpost. Roosevelt decides, you know what, we got to fix the problem. So this is how we're going to do it. We're going to bring in the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. We're going to bring them into the Oval Office, and we're going to tell them, you fix the game or else. Now, Roosevelt didn't like the president of Harvard, Charles Eliot. In fact, didn't like is probably too weak a word, or words. How about hated? Absolutely hated. And the Harvard contingent wanted to change football. Walter Camp, who came along on the scene in 1876, Yale University up in New Haven, and wrote the initial rules of football, wanted to keep it as is, and Princeton could have gone either way. But it was because of Roosevelt's hatred of Eliot that a number of things happened. Oh, here is a cartoon or an editorial piece in one of the newspapers, and you can see that there's the skeleton. There's the shawl wrapped around the head or the neck, another shawl with death across it, and behind that player is about ready to snap the ball are the scores of down football players, dead football players. And underneath it says the 12th player in every football game. Also, take a look at the football. The football looks more like a watermelon than it does a football. And this is an important aspect of changes about to come. No one could figure out how Roosevelt could just end the game. I mean, he couldn't. But maybe a threat of a ban to get changes in playing rules to make the game safer might work. And it did. The Roosevelt Initiative would eventually lead to the formation of the NCAA. There is 1904 action, and if you look very closely, there are guys who are basically throwing themselves at one another. Columbia, Duke, and Northwestern suspended their football programs. The Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, said he would make an example of any West Point cadet who plays rough football and have him dismissed if necessary. So these guys are meaning business. And there is Charles Eliot, who is the mortal enemy of Theodore Roosevelt. According to the New York Times, Harvard President Charles Eliot said that football was more brutalizing than prize fighting, cockfighting, or bullfighting. I demand that football changes its rules or be abolished. Change the game or forsake it, said Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. suffered major injuries in high school and in college football. But Theodore Roosevelt really didn't want to get rid of football. He really, really didn't want to get rid of football. And these guys that you're looking at, those guys, the Rough Riders, are the reason that he wanted to keep football going. And also his hatred of Charles Eliot, because whatever it is, I'm against it. So Roosevelt had a soft spot for the game. 10 of the Rough Riders, the soldiers who fought with him in Cuba, gave their occupations as football players when they enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces in 1898. It's a deadly game, and take a look at these guys. No protection for the head. Absolutely no protection for the head. Guys running into each other and could snap a neck or two or three. The American Football Rules Committee was formed, and in 1906, plays designed to open up the game and make it less dangerous to play were introduced. 1st and 5 became 1st and 10 on the series of first downs. 1st and 5, what you could do is pick up a guy and fling him. And they used to do that. They picked up guys and flung them over the line. The committee passed legislation that led to the introduction of the forward pass, changing the distance for first down from 5 yards to 10 yards. More importantly, all mass formations and gang tackling were banned. This probably would hurt the New York Jets. They'd probably be better off with 1st and 5, considering their offense this year. Just a little editorial comment. And there's William Howard Taft. Now, he didn't do anything in terms of introducing laws. He was a big man. You could see he was a big man, but he did something that kind of became a tradition in baseball. Taft goes to opening day in Washington, April 14th, 1910, throws out the first pitch. He was having a terrible day in the Oval Office. That week, women were in Washington. Suffragettes were in Washington looking for the vote. Taft meets them at the White House, and he's having a tough time with these women who are just saying, why can't we vote? Why can't we vote? Tell us why. Why won't you let us vote? Why won't you let us vote? Although there were some women in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah who could legally vote, but the rest of the country couldn't. So he's having a really bad day at the office. So he asks one of his aides. He says, "Hey, listen, it's opening day over there at the stadium. See if you could get us some tickets there for me and the staff, because we got to get out of here. These women are giving us such a hard time. I need to relax, enjoy myself. Let's go to a baseball game." Well, yeah, they get the tickets. And Taft is set up to throw out the first pitch. They have a little area for him. Take a look at the way everybody's dressed up there in their fedoras and bowler hats and all that. And take a look at how many women are there and how many men, because in 1910, it was unladylike to go to a baseball game. So he throws out the first pitch, and with that, he starts a tradition of the presidential first pitch in Washington, which lasted until the team moved out of Washington in 1971. So he starts that. Also, you have to take a look at the seats. Seats back in those days were 19 inches. Today, they are 23 inches across. Taft is a big, big man, really big man. Even though baseball games flew by in those days, there was one game that lasted 51 minutes in that time period. He got a little antsy in the seat, and it's the end of the top of the 7th inning, and he stands up. The crowd in Washington also stands up. They're looking at him. Now, the reason they stood up, sign of respect, because they thought he was leaving the game, but he wasn't. He was just stretching out in the 7th inning. He was cramped, and then he sits down, and they sat down. And that is the start of the traditional 7th inning stretch. Woodrow Wilson in World War I. Now, Wilson really didn't do anything in sports, or did he? Well, yeah, he kind of did. The Army General Enoch Crowder convinced Newton Baker, the U.S. Secretary of War at the time, 1917, that any draft eligible men employed in non essential jobs should be forced to choose enlist to help stateside or risk going to the front lines of Europe, because baseball was non essential during World War I. The 1918 World Series was played in September, not October. The reason why the American League decided that they should play less games, National League wanted to play more. There was a compromise, and the Boston Red Sox would win the World Series. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Many players did enlist in the war effort. Hank Gowdy was the first player to enlist. The American League didn't want to play. The National League did want to play. Oh, get into the game. Get into the game. Take a look at this cartoon. It's Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam is swinging a baseball bat because they want you, the Wilson administration, to support the war effort. And there was something called the Committee on Public Information, created by Wilson. It was a propaganda arm, really was a propaganda arm to raise patriotism. The national anthem, which was not the national anthem at that point, Star Spangled Banner, was played almost every day of the World Series when the Red Sox hosted games. Eventually, it would be expanded to all Red Sox home games in other teams. Star Spangled Banner was performed as early as 1897 at opening day ceremonies in Philadelphia, and then more regularly at the Polo Grounds up in Upper Manhattan in New York City, beginning in 1898. It was not the national anthem until 1931. U.S. military band was on hand for Game 1, Fenway Park, 1918 World Series. During the seventh inning stretch, which had become a thing by this point because of William Howard Taft, that Thursday evening, it played an impromptu rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. The regular playing of the song started in 1918, part of a military thing, part of people getting involved in the war. Herbert Hoover. Mr. We could use a man like Herbert Hoover again. There he is with a baseball. Herbert Hoover nearly put a number of baseball teams out of business in 1932. The Babe's holding out, Babe Ruth. He wants $80,000 for the 1932 season, and he's met with a gaggle of reporters in New York talking about his contract demands. Somebody says to the Babe, "Hey, Babe, $80,000. That's more than the president of the United States is making." And Babe says, "Well, what the hell's Hoover got to do with this? Besides, I had a better year than he did." Anyway, he did get that $80,000. Hoover in 1932 decided one way out of the Depression was a 1932 amusement tax, a levy designed to raise more money for the United States government fight against the Great Depression, and it hurt baseball attendance, also football attendance, also movie theater attendance, also Broadway attendance. Well, Franklin Roosevelt. My wife and I went up to visit Franklin Roosevelt about 6 years ago. He was a great host. He really was a great host. And I had some questions for him. I had a number of questions for him, like, why'd you allow the U.S. Olympic team to go to Berlin in 1936? Oh, you were the first guy on commercial TV in the United States in 1939, opening up the World's Fair. What was that about? And also Pearl Harbor and baseball playing after Pearl Harbor. This is the background. In 1935, the former Assistant Secretary for the United States Navy, Ernest Lee Janke, and Jeremiah Mahoney, Jeremiah Mahoney, pushed for an American boycott of the 1936 Berlin Summer Games. Janke was an American International Olympic Committee delegate and expressed outrage with reports of what was happening within Hitler's Germany. And on November 25th, 1935, sent a letter to the International Olympic Committee President, Count Henri Latour. There were a lot of counts and earls and lords, like a lot of out-of-work royalty that worked for the International Olympic Committee. floating the initial idea of an American boycott of the 1936 Berlin Summer Games. The judge, Jeremiah Mahoney, recommended that America drop out of the Berlin Games. A number of United States Catholic leaders joined with Mahoney, including New York Governor Al Smith and Massachusetts Governor James Curley, calling for a boycott. The Berlin or Hitler Olympics was politically charged. President Franklin Roosevelt urged the American team to go to the Berlin Games, knowing full well about the strangling of Jewish rights in Germany. I worked with Marty Glickman in 1988 at Marty's School of Broadcasting. And Marty's on the left, he's 18 years old. And Sam Stoller is on the right. And I knew him from the Milrose Games because he ran the Milrose Games. It's kind of interesting because in the 1936 Olympics, I knew the three most prominent Jews who did not participate in the Olympics, the two Americans, Marty and Sam, and also Gretel Bergman, who was the best athlete in Europe, German Jew, and she was on the team until she wasn't 2 weeks before the Berlin event. And I interviewed her about 30 years ago. And I said to her, why'd you go along with Hitler? And she said, had to give my people a ray of opportunity. Marty said that he didn't run along with Sam because Avery Brundage, who is a Hitler buddy, didn't want to embarrass the Fuhrer and see two Jews from New York with gold medals after they won the 4x400 meter relay. So Roosevelt said, go. It's the politicians' jobs to work out things, not athletes. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Roosevelt sent baseball commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis a letter after Kennesaw Mountain Landis said, what we should do? What should we do? What should we do? What should we do? And Roosevelt did not make an official order. It's just a suggestion. And it's called the Green Light Letter. You could go up to Cooperstown or you could go to the Franklin Roosevelt Museum in Hyde Park and see the letter. Green Light Letter basically said, you got to play. It's good for the morale of the country. People need to take their minds off of the war. Let them go see baseball. There will be fewer people unemployed, and everyone will work longer hours and harder than ever before. And that means they ought to have a chance for recreation and for taking their minds off their work even more than before. The other sports leagues that were functioning at the time, the National Football League, National Hockey League, went along with Roosevelt. National Hockey League was a little different because most of the players were Canadian. Canadians got into the war in 1939, and the war actually cost New York a second hockey team. The New York Americans, they were supposed to go to Brooklyn, build their own arena in Brooklyn, and that never happened. There was no basketball as we know it, and Joe Louis would go on and give exhibitions and raise money for the military as the world champion, boxing champion. Ike. I like Ike. Well, this is a great story. It comes from Bill Cleary, who was part of the United States Olympic hockey team in 1959. It's 56 rather, and 1960. It's the Cold War. Sputnik had just been launched. And Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, are looking to see if they could find some mutual areas to tone down the Cold War. So he decides, Eisenhower, we'll send our national hockey team to Moscow to play some games against the Soviets. We'll also send a track and field team, and in return, we'll let the ballet, okay? Can't get it out. The ballet and the Moscow Circus. Remember the Moscow Circus with the dancing bears that would be on Ed Sullivan? I used to love watching the dancing bears and all. So the ballet and the circus come to the United States. Hockey team and the track and field team go to Moscow and other places in the Soviet Union. And there is Bill Cleary. And this was in 1995. We were talking. We're at Rockefeller Center, the ice skating rink, and the National Olympic team, the U.S. Olympic team, committee rather, honoring the 35th anniversary of USA winning the gold medal in Squaw Valley, Lake Placid, 19 Squaw Valley, Lake Tahoe, and Lake Placid in 1980. And so Cleary and I talked, and he said, "Hey, do you ever hear the story?" I said, "What story?" "Of us going to the Soviet Union." I said, "No, no, tell me the story." And he said, "Yeah." He said, Eisenhower decides he's sending the hockey team over. And he said, "We're a bunch of college kids, firemen, all that other stuff, and we're up in Boston." So we take the plane to Moscow. And we get to Moscow and we get to the airport. We all get on a bus and we go to the fanciest hotel in town, which probably was painted gray because everything's painted gray there. And so they get to the hotel and they check in their rooms. And he says, and they're looking for bugs in their rooms. They're going, picking up some of the carpeting. They're looking for bugs behind the curtains, and maybe up in the ceiling, who knows where the microphones are. So they were very aware, or said they were aware, that Soviets might be bugging them. So they come to a dinner. That's the next step there. They get dressed and go to a formal dinner in the main ballroom. And they're going in and they're taking their seats. And typical fare, you got your one plate, you got another plate, you got your knife, you got your fork, you got your spoon, you got your napkin, and all that other stuff. And then you have your soup plate. And you look down at the soup plate, and there was a small replica of Sputnik. Ha ha, we beat you in the space. I said to Cleary, I said, "You take it home?" He said, "No, I didn't want to go to a gulag." But anyway, they were supposed to be intimidated. The Soviets placed models of every Sputnik spacecraft at every table where the Americans died to remind them that the Soviet Union, not the United States, was successful in getting into space. The intimidation tactic. Anyway, there's Sputnik, little beach ball type thing, spindly arms, and went beep, 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 beep. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was president for 2 years and 10 months, roughly. And he did two things that impacted the sports world. He got TV money into the NFL's hands, and he desegregated the then Washington Redskins football team. John Kennedy was assassinated 60 years ago last week, November 22nd, 1963, and he left one permanent impression on the sports world. He created a massive revenue stream for sports owners by signing the Sports Broadcast Act of 1961. He was not responsible for the actual legislation. A Brooklyn, New York congressman by the name of Emanuel Seller, probably was about 100 years old at the time, wrote the bill, but gets no credit these days for changing the sports landscape in the United States. The Seller bill allowed the National Football League to market its broadcast rights as a league package, evenly spreading broadcast revenues among the franchises and guaranteeing each team substantial annual revenues. And there is Emanuel Seller. The act would also apply to the National Basketball Association, National Hockey League, and other sports. Major League Baseball had an antitrust exemption, didn't need the federal law, as the American and National Leagues could sell the product, baseball, as one to TV networks, and they sold it to NBC. The other thing that he did, take a look at this guy. You want to meet this guy in an alley? Just look at him. Ooh, George Preston Marshall. JFK and the NFL Washington team. George Preston Marshall did not hire Negro players for his Washington NFL team. Marshall would be the last holdout in hiring Negro players. Marshall gave in because of a threat by the Kennedy administration to bar Marshall from moving his football team into a federally funded D.C. stadium in 1962 because of equal opportunity work requirements. Marshall's team played a couple games in 1961 at the new stadium. The federal government decided to build a multi-purpose stadium in Washington for baseball American League senators to replace Griffith Stadium along with Marshall's team. That is Stuart Udell, and he was the Secretary of the Interior, and there is John Kennedy. The stadium forced Marshall's hand as Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udell, pushed Marshall and made him obey legislation that prohibited discrimination in federal facilities. D.C. Stadium was a federal facility. Udell gave Marshall an ultimatum: either hire Negro players or you go find somewhere else to play. Ernie Davis was the guy who was drafted by George Preston Marshall, and he was traded to the Cleveland Browns for Bobby Mitchell, a guy I knew. And about 30 years ago, I said, Bobby, I bet you that you're glad you never became that dentist that you wanted to do at Ohio State. And he said, yeah. I said, you became Mr. Football. Bobby Mitchell, if there was any party in Washington, and if Bobby Mitchell was there, it was an important party. Bobby Mitchell, for years and years and years, was the most important player in Washington in terms of football. Marshall had a 30-year lease with the federal government. He picks Ernie Davis to shut up the Kennedy administration. He sent Davis to Cleveland for Mitchell in the first-round draft pick. After the 1962 draft, the deal was great for Mitchell. Unfortunately, Davis had leukemia, and he died without ever playing a game for Cleveland. John F. Kennedy brought back an old tradition, bring the winning teams, this happened to be the Boston Celtics, to the White House. And to his right is Red Auerbach, the coach of the Boston Celtics, general manager. Some of the other people in there are Tommy Heinsohn and Satch Sanders and Sam Jones and John Havlicek, the guy on the left. In front of him is Buddy LaRue, who's the trainer. Auerbach, 1964, got State Department permission to take an all-star team around the world. His goal, and the State Department's goal, was to have the American team play the Soviet team in Red Square. But the American team in 1964 was killing everybody. They were clobbering everybody, and the tour ended in Egypt. They never got to Red Square. Oh, there's Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson's the guy responsible for, starting the Super Bowl holiday. Lyndon Johnson signed the 1966 bill that would ultimately create the Super Bowl. Most of the legwork for the bill would come from, hey, that guy again, Emanuel Seller from Brooklyn, and two Louisiana politicians, Senator Russell Long and Congressman Hale Boggs. Hale Boggs was the father of Cokie Roberts, who was on ABC and NPR for a long time. The Super Bowl was created in part by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Super Bowl roots could be traced back to a game that was never played, the 1965 American Football League All-Star Game in New Orleans. African-American players boycotted that game and set off a series of events that concluded in the first championship game between the American Football League and the National Football League almost 2 years later. Despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, African-American players who were selected to play in New Orleans encountered problems. The African-American players were denied cab rides into New Orleans, called names, threatened with death. Cookie Gilchrist, who was with the Buffalo Bills, decided to call a meeting to discuss the 36 hours of what was basically Jim Crow on steroids against these guys. New Orleans never got, and this is a very long story, so I'm not going to get into it here. It's part of the Super Bowl talk. New Orleans never got an AFL team. They were promised an AFL team at halftime of that game, had it been played, but didn't happen. But when the two leagues merged in 1966, New Orleans became a political football. When the AFL and NFL merged in 66, the merger needed congressional approval first, and there were two roadblocks: Louisiana Senator Russell Long and Congressman Hale Boggs. Louisiana, two powerful members in both chambers. Well, there's a picture of me, Pete Rozelle, 1986. I have the tie on there. I even have hair there. I was also 30 years old. Me and Pete. NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle lobbied both and said, and got the answer he got from them, that they didn't see how a merger would benefit New Orleans. Eventually, Roselle got a deal together, a 1967 NFL expansion team for New Orleans in exchange for Long and Boggs' support. It worked. There were some other political maneuvers by Seller that kept the 15 NFL teams and the 9 AFL teams in their cities, including keeping the New York Jets and Joe Namath from moving from New York to Los Angeles. The first Super Bowl was called the AFL NFL World Championship Game. It was hastily put together. It was played in Los Angeles, and 1/3 of the house was empty. That was the last Super Bowl ever to, you could walk right up and get tickets. And Miami in '69 was similar to that. There were tickets available to almost game time, but it was sold out. Oh, there's Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon has a lot to do with sports. Nixon and ping pong diplomacy. Richard Nixon went to China in 1972 after a United States table tennis team traveled to then Red or Communist China, they don't call that anymore, to challenge a Chinese squad in April 1971. It was called ping pong diplomacy, produced a thaw in United States-Red-China relationship. During the 1971 World Table Tennis Championships in Nagoya, Japan, 19-year-old U.S. player Glenn Cowan, who my wife actually knew from the beach clubs in New Rochelle, hopped on a shuttle bus carrying the red-shirted Chinese national team. Chuang Zhang stepped forward to shake Cowan's hand, speak to him through an interpreter. He presented him with a gift, a silk screen of China's Hengsheng Mountains. Cowan, a self-described hippie, except there's no definition ever for a hippie. They never left any ideology. They never even called themselves hippie. Returned the gesture the following day, giving Chikan a t-shirt emblazoned with a peace symbol and the Beatles lyric, or the McCartney lyric, "Let It Be." Mao shocked the world by inviting them to make an all-expense-paid trip to China. Come on down. You're going to go to the Wall of China. After checking with their embassy, the American players accepted. I was surprised as I was pleased. President Nixon later wrote in his memoirs, "I never expected that the China initiative would come to fruition in form of a ping pong team." On April 14th, the same day that the American players met with Zhou Enlai, President Nixon announced that the United States was easing its travel bans and trade embargoes against China. The American and Chinese governments soon opened new back-channel communications with one another. Also, Nixon signed into law something called Title IX, which was June 23rd, 1972. Title IX was never supposed to be a sports act. It was supposed to be an education act. And that's Edith Green, who, beginning in 1955, wanted an equal rights act for women to go to college, that women could get the same courses as men did. Nixon signed the Title IX legislation that was designed to give women an equal opportunity to get education in American colleges and universities with men. Title IX, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The battle of the Title IX legislation in women's sports is still being fought, with some coaches and athletic directors crying foul, saying that they have to cut men's sports programs and keep women's programs to stay in compliance with Title IX rules. Also, Nixon had a problem with, that guy again, Avery Brundage, in that country again, Germany, the Munich massacre. The Munich 11, the 9 athletes and the 2 coaches that were killed during a Palestinian terrorist attack at the Olympic Village in Munich. The massacre, famous picture of one of the terrorists. And there is Nixon. Nixon, in a telegram, demanded that the rest of the games be called off as the terrorist attack is unfolding. But this guy, Avery Brundage, you remember him, Hitler's friend, he helped build German Nazi offices in Washington in 1937 with his construction company. No, 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 no. International Olympic Committee president, bigger than Richard Nixon, bigger than the American presidency. Um, he said the games must go on. They went on. They went on. There was a little pause. Nixon was furious. Oh, Nixon also liked to sit around in his underwear every once in a while, scratch like men scratch to watch football. And he really wants to watch football. He really wants to watch football. It's 1972. He's the most powerful man in the world. He's in Washington, and he can't watch George Allen's football team play Green Bay in a playoff game around Christmas. 1950, NFL Commissioner Burt Bell told his owners to black out home games to get people to buy tickets for home games instead of sitting in front of a television. Bell's plea to his owners came after the Los Angeles Rams ownership saw a 50% drop in attendance in 1949 compared to 1948 after the team signed a deal with the Admiral Television Company in Southern California. Basically, I don't know if you remember Admiral TVs. Admiral was going to pay, or did pay, Daniel Reeves, the owner of the Rams, X amount of dollars and have all the games on TV because they saw it as a way of selling Admiral televisions. There were only 2 TV stations in Los Angeles in 1949. There it is. Your Admiral dealer presents Dick Huffman, tackle, and they talk about him, 27 years old. Get the complete set of Rams football cards from your Admiral dealer. By 1951, the NFL was in court defending its blackout policy. 1953, in Philadelphia, Judge Alan K. Grimm upheld the league's blackout policy, believing it was not in violation of antitrust laws. The blackout problem resurfaced in 1957 when the NFL championship game was blacked out in the host city of Detroit, despite being a sellout. So here's Dick Nixon, and he's got nothing to do. And he's there, and to his left is George Allen, the coach of Washington. And the guy on the far, far right, Marv Levy, who's still alive, is the only coach in NFL history to ever graduate with a degree in English from Harvard. Let's talk to him about that, you over-officiatious jerk. Use that on NFL films. But anyway, here's Nixon. I got nothing to do. There's nothing going on, Watergate, I don't know. There's something called Watergate. Nah, I'm not going to worry about that. Let's do this Dragnet style. December 18th, 1972, 2:06 in the afternoon, Nixon met with Attorney General Richard Kleindienst at the Executive Office building. The reason? He wanted to watch his friend George Allen's Washington NFL team playoff game, but couldn't. Nixon wanted to intervene because the Washington Green Bay Packers postseason game at RFK Stadium on Christmas Eve was going to be blacked out in Washington, D.C., even though the game was sold out. Now, he could have gone to Camp David, after all. This place was named after his son-in-law, and could have gone up there and sat in his underwear and scratched himself or whatever, but he didn't. He wanted to stay at the White House. He couldn't watch the game. Compromise was reached, allowing blackouts if any game was not sold out within 72 hours of kickoff. Nixon signed the blackout law. Before the 1973 season, the league adopted the 72-hour rule even after the law expired in 1978, and there are no blackouts today, even though games they get around. As long as all of the luxury boxes, the big ticket item seats are sold out, there may be scattered seats. As long as they're sold out, they'll put the games on TV. Oh, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford as a college football player. Lyndon Johnson once thought Gerald Ford played without a helmet, and that was cause of his problems. Anyway, the NCAA, and he signs into law a change for the NCAA. Because the NCAA believes in something called principle and amateurism, they never did, and looks after athletes by keeping them away from the temptation of professionalism and commercialism, and looks after the best interests of the student athletes. They never did. The group got a special tax-exempt status as a charitable organization under the Internal Revenue Code. as well as Congress and President Gerald Ford in 1976. Colleges whose football teams appear at bowl games don't have to pay taxes on their take from the game. Hey, it's amateurism. And there is Gerald Ford. In 1976, Ford told Major League Baseball Commissioner Bowie Kuhn that Toronto could not have an expansion team until Washington, D.C. got one. The Senators' franchise moved to Texas in 1972. Well, hey, look, sports is more important than the President of the United States. MLB said, Bowie Kuhn, the commissioner, thank you, President Ford, but we're going to do what we're going to do. And Toronto was allowed to keep its American League expansion franchise, and Major League Baseball did not sacrifice its antitrust exemption. Jimmy Carter and the Olympic boycott, 1980. 1980, President Carter gave an ultimatum to the Soviet Union: pull your troops out of Afghanistan by February 20th, 1980, or the United States would boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. On March 21st, the United States did pull out of the Moscow Games. The United States was joined by 60 other countries in the boycott. USA, USA, USA. That's the first time that chant was ever heard in Lake Placid, New York, as the Americans beat the Soviets to get an opportunity to win the gold medal. The Americans did not win the gold medal by beating the Soviets. In fact, most people in the United States had no idea the game was taking place. It took place in the afternoon. It was going to be shown at night, tape delay. Although, if you were in the border cities on the American-Canadian border and picked up Canadian TV, you got to see this game live in Detroit, Buffalo, maybe Buffalo, certainly in New England states, in Maine and Washington and Idaho and Montana and North Dakota and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan. Carter issued a trade embargo on two U.S. goods that the USSR desperately needed: grain and information technology. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled ocean waters. All this because the Soviets were in Afghanistan. The boycott failed. The athletes did not go. Ronald Reagan, few things that he did. 1984, Reagan signed into law the Cable TV Act of 1984, something which held up for 40 years. Now cable TV is disintegrating. What it did was socialize cable TV for those who wanted everything offered on a basic expanded tier. Consumers bought everything offered on the tier. It's all or nothing at all. There was no choice. The legislation saved ESPN and CNN and others from financial ruin, and sports operators started getting major money from cable TV. That is a baseball stadium in Cincinnati. It's the home of the Cincinnati Reds Major League Baseball team. And I'm just using Cincinnati just as an example of what happened after the 1986 tax code reform was signed into law. Reagan left an enormous impact on sports by putting his signature on the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Tax Reform Act of 1986 opened a loophole in the tax laws and gave owners ammunition in their battles with cities and states to get stadiums. The law gave municipalities federal tax exemption on bonds to build new stadiums. After the 1986 tax code revision was passed, sports owners figured out that under the right set of circumstances, an owner could keep up to 92% or 2 cents out of every dollar generated in a publicly funded stadium or an arena. George W. Bush. Hey, you know what that picture is? That picture is of your tax dollars at work, because the U.S. State Department sent me there to talk to 20 students about the politics of sports business. 3 Russians, 3 Nigerians, 3 Indonesians, 3 Turks, 3 Venezuelans, Canadian was thrown in, and 4 Americans. Your tax dollars at work. President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Anabolic Steroids Control Act of 1990. The legislation made the possession of steroids without a physician's approval illegal. Bill Clinton. Oh, Bill Clinton. He thought that he could settle the dispute between the baseball players and the baseball owners. Hey, Bill, you should have given me a call. I would have saved you all that trouble. I could have told you it was a mission impossible. And he found out it was mission impossible. 1994, President Bill Clinton called the warring sides together in the Major League Baseball Players Association strike against the owners and get here to the Oval Office. Clinton tried to hammer out a settlement. It failed miserably. Everybody else would have failed miserably too in those days. That dispute was settled by a New York judge by the name of Sonia Sotomayor, who found that the owners bargained in bad faith. And I was in the courtroom that day, 1995, when Sotomayor said, "Play ball." They worked out something. The Court Flood Act of 1998, signed into law by Clinton, gives baseball players the same rights under American antitrust laws that basketball, football, hockey, and soccer players enjoy, the right to strike. George W. Bush, the former managing partner of the Texas Rangers. I dealt with him when he was in the American League as the managing general partner of the Rangers. In 2004, Bush included a segment on steroids and athletes using steroids in sports in his State of the Union address. By 2005, Congress held hearings on the use of steroids in sports. The Bush administration provided a good deal of security for the Athens, Greece Olympics in 2004 as part of the war on terrorism. There were more boots on the ground for the 2002 Salt Lake City Olympics than in Afghanistan after 9/11, September 11th, 2001. Obama, there's another one. Hey, Barack, just give me a call. I could have saved you a trip to Copenhagen. Obama's Olympic failure. And this was when Chicago wanted the 2016 Olympics, Summer Olympics. I remember this vividly when Chicago had the bid for the 2016 Olympics. A very effective committee had flown to Copenhagen to make their presentation, and Michelle Obama, had gone with them. I got a call, I think before the thing ended, but on fairly short notice, that everybody thought if I flew out there, we'd have a good chance of getting it, and it might be worth essentially just taking a one-day trip. Well, to Copenhagen one day from Washington is quite the trip. So we fly out there. Subsequently, I think we've learned that the IOC's decisions, the International Olympic Committee's decisions, are similar to FIFA, the governing body of soccer's decisions. A little bit cooked. Now, they're overcooked. They're not a little bit cooked. We didn't even make the first cut, despite the fact that by all objective metrics, the American bid was the best. Obama came, this is the time where CTE was discovered, the fluid that leaks on the brain that kind of starts destroying the brain, that was caused by high collision impacts, football field, on the hockey rink, and actually it doesn't even need high collision. I know Bennett Amalu, who was the guy who discovered CTE, and he explained it to me one day like this: football players keep getting hit and hit and hit and hit. This is the analogy. You're in a car accident and you're going 40 miles an hour and you're sitting in the front and the airbags come flying out and they come at you and they stop you. They do stop you, but internally you're not being stopped. Everything is moving at that rate internally. So it's little hits too that impact you, your brain, whether it's football or hockey. And in girls' cases, girls' heads develop, or the skulls develop more slowly than excuse me, than boys. And hitting a soccer ball with your head, if you're a girl or if you're a boy, is not the best thing you could do. So Obama has this summit. He said if he had boys, he doubts that he would allow them to play football, and nothing comes of it. By the way, the entire question of concussions and football has been totally swept away. You don't hear a word about that. Not one word about it, amazingly enough. Donald Trump pledged support for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics bid. Los Angeles got the bid, or got the games. Pledged support for the 2026 World Cup bid, soccer, by the US, Canada, and Mexico. All three countries are hosting that event. Pardoned Jack Jones, the boxer who was arrested on the Mann Act for taking basically white women across state lines. The whole Mann Act was all about Jack Johnson, who basically was the boxing heavyweight champion of the world around 1910, 11, and people didn't like it. The Mann Act was signed into law by William Howard Taft. Criticized NFL and NBA players for protesting during the national anthem. The athletes' White House visits were contentious. And Joe Biden, we finish up with him. 2021 Tokyo Olympics, send or not, because of COVID-19, the athletes went. 2022 Olympics in China, go or not go because of human rights abuses, the athletes went, but the diplomats didn't. Traditionally, the First Lady of the United States represents the United States at an Olympics. Jill Biden did not go. In fact, there were many politicians who did not go to China. Biden in rugby. In 2022, Joe Biden said the government guarantees required to host such a rugby tournament, and there's going to be a rugby tournament in the United States, two of them, would be executed by officials who have the competence and authority. Biden said the United States is ready to deliver the most successful Rugby World Cups in history. Well, guess who got the events? Rugby's men's championship events are headed to America in 2031, and the women's rugby championship event will take place in America in 2023. Let kids play. Let's kids play. And there are all kinds of issues facing sports right now. Biden may be in favor of paying college athletes. In April 2023, Biden's Education Department announced a proposed change to Title IX, which prohibits sex-based discrimination in federally funded education programs. The proposal would make it illegal for schools to broadly ban transgender students from sports teams that align with their gender identity rather than their assigned sex at birth, and that continues. Presidential decisions matter to the sports industry and to society in general, and have lasting effects, whether it's Jimmy Carter's boycott, whether it's Richard Nixon opening up China, ping pong diplomacy, whether it's Dwight Eisenhower trying to find some area in the Cold War to work with the Soviet Union, or whether it's Teddy Roosevelt banning football, or Ronald Reagan putting more money into sports with the Cable TV Act of 1984 and the tax code revisions, or to Bill Clinton's failure to get the warring sides together in 1994 in the baseball dispute, Barack Obama not getting Chicago the Olympics in 2016. Decisions matter. Decisions by presidents matter, not only to sports, but also to the general society. Thank you, Stephen, so much. Thanks, everybody else. Any questions or comments? It is your turn. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Morvith and thank you to Shai. Thank you both for your commentary or the comments.